One of the other things you say that, I mean, I'm sure as people read your book, they'll, you'll get a big amen on this, but you talk in your book about how too much training focuses on the symptom, which are a person's
Yeah.
actions, instead of the root cause of bad leadership, which is the person himself or herself. In general, though, how do we develop training that addresses the person versus just the behavior?
Yeah. Well, one of the most important things is first is to acknowledge what this research says. So ultimately, it means we have to be willing to talk about who. And I think that's the biggest and first barrier. It's almost as if it's taboo to talk about who the person is. And I get where it can be uncomfortable and difficult. And the only place you attempt to have these conversations normally is with your kids. And you know, and they're a captive audience. So what are they going to do? They don't have a lot of recourse. But the reality is, if we can normalize the development of who we are in any organization, profit, nonprofit, academics, athletics, wherever, if we can normalize that, and I think that begins with us as leaders saying, I need work, me, on me. Like we can talk about you, and that'll be fine. But I am not a perfectly formed human being. It's really interesting because I don't run into people that say they're perfectly formed. In fact, I run into everybody says nobody's perfect. But what I find in that, and you know, if my wife were on the call here, she'd probably say that I'm guilty of this as well. So, you know, all of this applies to me too. Is that how often am I willing to follow up the phrase "I'm not perfect" with let me give you some specific and meaningful examples about where I've dropped the ball that's created damage or problems for other people. We don't usually go to that step. We usually say, you know what, I'm not perfect. I did wad up a piece of paper and throw it at the trash can today, and I missed. So you know that's at least I can say I'm imperfect like that. We don't get to the core of things like greed and selfishness and self-interest and insecurity and all these things, all these kind of rather ugly things that live to a certain extent in all of us. And hopefully we're growing and developing to move past these things. So I think the first and biggest barrier is that we have to be okay with talking about who. And that begins first with us as leaders doing the really hard thing. I mean, some people have an easier time than others, but for many people, beginning to acknowledge their own shortcomings that matter. You know, not the waste paper basket idea, but something that actually impacts others. Beginning to acknowledge that and saying, hey, because when the leader says, here are some things that I'm working on for myself right now. I'm working on, I think the one that's most taboo. Here's the thing that would just blow people away if you walked into your office or wherever you work and said this. I'm going to work on becoming a person of better character. I need to raise my level of integrity. I need to raise my level of honesty because implied in that, oh no, you mean that you are not the nth degree of integrity or honesty already? And the reality is when you begin to unpack ideas and the idea of who you are is so much bigger than these things, but I use these things because people are rather familiar with the idea. But when you really begin to dig into something like honesty, there's actually a lot more gray. We make it a black and white thing when we're 8 years old, but you get into adult life and there's a lot more gray about what does it look like to be a truly honest leader? What does that look like? Okay, when we get into the nuance of it, yeah, there is space for me to grow and develop. So I think we as leaders need to go first in engaging in this dialogue, and then we need to work to make it a common language. And hopefully, by exposing people to this research and this data, we can begin to open people up to say, hey, this just needs to be a normal conversation where we are all, as leaders, working to become more developed in who we are.